how do they assess these things? Well, it's quite simple. It's by asking you questions, behavioral questions. For instance, how do you handle a difficult coworker, or to ask you to talk about your greatest successes. And the main thing that you should realize here, that you interview with one of the best companies in the world. So even if the highlight of your job is not to be an amazing communicator, you should be at least a great communicator in this case. Now, how do you go about that? Well, I believe the best way to prepare for the behavioral part of the interview would be to work on preparing your own stories. I believe around 5 stories. And for example, one story should be about your greatest success in your career, or one story could be about a time when you dealt with a major failure. So the approach that I'm proposing here would be to take your time and write down all the possible details about one story, for instance. And even if it takes 1 hour, that's not greatly exaggerating it. And the main reason is here to try to remember as much as information as possible with respect to that particular event. Now, then after you have all the details in place, and preferably in a narrative format, try to synthesize that information into essentially 4 sections. The first is to talk about the situation that you experienced. The second, about the tasks that you had to perform, and these first 2 can go together if you want. Then the third one, talk about the actions that you took in that given situation and those given tasks. And finally, talk about the resolve of that situation. And actually framing your story around these 4 milestones, if you want, is what people call a star answer, or the star interviewing method. Now, again, some highlights: you keep everything in a narrative format, and it's very important that you first try to remember as much information as possible about those events, and I explain you later why. Again, you do this for 1 story, so ideally you should have at least 5 such stories. You should have as much content as possible. Why is it important to have as much content as possible? Well, because let's say I ask you a behavioral question right now. Tell me about a moment you dealt with a difficult coworker, right? So your main focus in such a scenario would be to know how to frame your answer, as opposed to think about the situation and spend extra brain cycles to think about the specific details about that given situation. So if you prepare that story in advance, you will have that reflex of getting the most important elements of that specific situation, and synthesize them into an answer that will hopefully connect very well with your recruiter, because after all, the goal is to connect well and to make a good impression to that recruiter. And in fact, there's a very interesting quote that I found on the internet from someone that actually got the job at Facebook. These interviewers are trained and calibrated to identify crappy people and have an acute attention to. It's a quick way to get your candidacy thrown out the window. Just be genuine, show passion for your work, own your flaws, show initiative for improvement, and you'll do fine. Now, the other step for preparing for this behavioral interview is to just simply look up the 20 most common behavioral questions. And in fact, here's a list from Facebook with fewer questions, but still very good ones. So the idea would be to take these questions and prepare answers for them. And ideally, you should prepare at least 2 to 3 answers for each of these questions. Why you should prepare multiple answers? Because your recruiter might be you might prefer giving different answers to different recruiters, not fake answers, but real answers, but different people connect in different ways, and this is why you want to prepare a different type of answer for a different type of recruiter. So again, you should take probably the 20 most common behavioral questions and just answer them. So here the best overall strategy to this to your behavioral interviewing quest here is to at least prepare those 5 stories and then answer the most common behavioral questions. And more likely than not, you will build up that reflex into properly answering these behavioral questions. And last but not least, also make sure that you also prepare some questions for Facebook. And a method that you want to keep in mind for brainstorming as to what's the best things that you should ask them is to use this 4 C's method, in which I basically give you these 4 areas that you might consider asking questions about. And finally, make sure that you have a positive attitude no matter what happens, because this is a well-known trap for too many introverts, and because engineers tend to be introverts more likely than not. And I'll just close with some interesting pieces of advice from Facebook's jobs website. Focus on your strengths. We like to ask, what were you doing on your very best day at work? We want you to do that not just on your best day, but every day. Show us something you've built. Builders look at the world with fresh eyes. They see things that are good but could be better and figure out how to make it so. We look for candidates who've got the same building mindset, whether they're applying for executive roles or internships. Share when you failed and learn. Don't hesitate to talk about the blunders you've made in the pursuit of big ideas. We want to hear about those as much as your wins. Now, I intentionally left out this from being a separate section in this video, simply because I don't believe that the best strategy to apply at Facebook is to have a keyword-rich resume. And in fact, an interesting piece of advice here is a quote from a recruiter. You should focus on telling a clear story about what you've done, and in a cover letter explain why you think you'd be a great fit for Facebook and what you want to contribute when you join. Now, this being said, you should invest a generous amount of time into writing a proper CV. And I say this because despite Facebook being primarily an engineering culture, recruiters there still do not appreciate typos. So make sure that you thoroughly check it before sending it. And by the way, you could also ask a friend to review it for you if this helps. Now, also, if you want a great example of what a one-page resume looks like, here's one. And finally, try a simple exercise. Try to read your CV in 6 seconds, because apparently this is how long it takes recruiters in general to review a CV and to form an impression about an applicant. So after reading your CV for 6 seconds, would you hire yourself?